At what point do you just Google it when playing a game? This is quite a wide spectrum. Some people will get online and search for a guide the moment they meet any objective that isn't obvious, while other people will stubbornly poke at every nook and cranny until they find the answer themselves, no matter how long it takes them. Personally, I like to think I'm somewhere in the middle. I always like to try and solve things myself, but I don't have infinite patience. And if I can't see a solution after a little while at poking at it from a few different angles, I find a guide to help me along my way. The problem is that when I do end up resorting to a guide, it ends up shattering the experience I was building for myself. Now, I'm not here to deride anyone who uses guides. It's a perfectly valid way to play games, and people needing guides is how I've made a living for several years now. But I bet that of those two theoretical people I mentioned, the person who spent so long working it out for themselves had a far more memorable experience than the person who looked it up immediately. Note though that the keyword there is memorable and not necessarily enjoyable, as I'm sure we've all had moments where we spent ages trying to solve something only to finally find the solution to be unsatisfying and have it stand out as a big negative mark against the game. It makes for a difficult balance when developing a game, especially in the modern era. A game being too handholdy is a common criticism of the AAA space, with some people who will froth at the mouth if they see even a hint of yellow paint on the landscape. Yet time and time again, the wider gaming audience proves that they're not willing to put in the effort to a game that doesn't hold their hand enough. Or rather, if they do venture into such a game, they end up ruining the experience for themselves in one way or another by finding ways to overcome how the game obfuscates information, which is to say, guides. Have you ever been playing a choices matter game and looked up the consequence of your actions before committing to a choice? Congratulations, you've just ruined the game for yourself. Well, at least that's how it looks on the surface, but have you really? Maybe you have a specific romance option in mind, and you came across a choice that might lock you out of it. And while accidentally screwing it up might make for a memorable, dynamic game, it could also kill your motivation to keep playing. I've seen people drop games they were otherwise really enjoying for exactly that reason, even though it's all consequences of their own actions. Maybe using a guide in that moment will kill the suspense of what's going to happen next in the narrative, but it could stop you from heading down a path that will lead to you being unsatisfied with the experience. Or there are times when playing without a guide would simply make things far too tedious. Like, be honest, did any of you actually work out the Stardew Valley villagers' favourite things through trial and error? You didn't, did you? None of us did. We all looked it up on the wiki, because who has the time to be giving Abigail their perfectly crafted meals when it turns out that she finds quartz just as delicious? But the opposite can also be true, as with what happened to my playthrough of 2022's Triangle Strategy. A spiritual successor to Final Fantasy Tactics, Triangle Strategy mixed great turn-based tactics gameplay with an engaging narrative that could branch in any number of different directions. Now, in a JRPG with choices like this, I'm no fool. I knew there'd be a true ending for me to find, but not wanting to spoil myself, I initially avoided looking it up. However, as I got deeper and deeper in with no clear path presenting itself, I fell to the temptation and looked up what the requirements were, only to discover that a seemingly innocuous choice I made much earlier in the game had unknowingly locked me out of getting the true ending, no matter what I did. That completely killed my motivation to finish it, and to this day, I've never gone back, even though I do think it's a great game. If I had just avoided looking that up, I would have carried on, reached one of the other 3 endings it's possible to get, and either walked away content, or had the motivation to go around again with New Game Plus, this time following a guide to get the true ending in a way I would have found much more satisfying. So that then begs the question, did I ruin the game for myself? Or was my decision to stop playing merely based on design decisions I didn't like, given the source of my frustration was a lack of clear indication of what the true ending path entailed? Who's at fault there? Me or the game? This is a question I've gone back and forth on a lot, as I began to write video game guides for a living. I've been doing it since 2022, and in that time I've had to chronicle how to do just about everything it's possible to do in massive and complex games like Baldur's Gate 3, Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, and Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, And as you might imagine, playing games like that fundamentally alters how you view them. When you have to make notes at every corner, carefully consider every angle to a problem, and constantly reload saves to find out all the possible outcomes of every decision you can make, you start to see games as less of an artistic whole and more as the web of systems underneath as you learn how they all affect each other. It brought me back to that question of how guides impact the play experience though, as in most cases I'd be playing these games pre-release, which means that it is completely impossible for me to look up things I don't know. Not only that, but the guides that I'd need to look up won't exist until I create them myself, at which point they'd be no use to me as a player. In most games, this isn't too much of an issue, as even with something like Baldur's Gate 3, there are clearly defined choices and outcomes at almost every turn, and special outcomes only require a small dose of lateral thinking, which is the kind of skill you need anyway for this job. However, there is one game that stands head and shoulders above all others in this regard. A game where being forced to play it without being able to look anything up turned it into one of my favourite gaming experiences of all time, and one that the general gaming audience will never be able to play in the same way. And that game is Dragon's Dogma 2. Chances are, Dragon's Dogma 2 is a game you aren't that fond of. It saw a big disparity between the critical response and the general audience reception. The majority of critics praised it extensively, myself included, while the general public was much cooler on it for a variety of reasons. However, one big factor that was completely out of anyone's control was the different circumstances under which those two groups of people played the game. Dragon's Dogma 2 does not hold your hand. While most main quests will give you reasonable objective markers, side quests are not as generous, and if you want to complete your objectives, you'll need to pay attention to NPCs, read your journal, and learn about the world around you. So it's no surprise that a lot of people who played it gravitated towards guides often. And while I don't blame people for doing that, and was in fact financially dependent on it at the time, I think it absolutely destroys the game. I first got my hands on the game about 3 weeks before launch, along with around 4 of my colleagues, which is quite a lot for a pre-launch period, but ended up being a necessity, as even the simplest seeming of quests could have an array of different outcomes, depending on how well you know the game and its systems, which went way deeper than we could imagine. And no quest shows this better than Hunt for the Jadeite Orb. You'll encounter this side quest around the midpoint of the game, and it isn't particularly important. It doesn't have any consequences later on in the story, and you don't meet any of its characters again. It's just there to earn a bit of cash. And yet, it stood out as the most memorable quest in the game. So let me walk you through it. As you enter the checkpoint rest town, you'll be approached by a young merchant named Ophiel, who tells you about a rare and valuable object, the Jadeite Orb, and recruits you in tracking it down. While there are no quest markers directing you to its location, it's not that hard to find, as it's sold by a shady merchant just a few feet away from where you get the quest. So, easy, right? Just buy the orb and hand it over for a quick reward. What's the big deal? Well, before you can get to the shop to buy the orb, you'll be approached by another merchant, Everard, who has heard that you're searching for the orb and wants it for himself, offering you a greater reward for finding it than Ophiel did. So now it seems like a simple binary choice. Give it to the nicer merchant for a smaller reward, or the stuck-up jerk for a bigger reward. We're not breaking any new ground so far, but that's when you'll discover the next layer of this puzzle. When you go to the aforementioned shady merchant to get the orb, he'll tell you that he's adept at making forgeries of valuable items. So now you have two people that want the same object, and a merchant capable of creating a forgery, for a cost. It doesn't take a genius to put 2 and 2 together here. You should create a fake orb and get a reward from both of the NPCs. Hell, you could even create 2 forgeries, keep the real thing for yourself and sell that on later. So, you do just that, patting yourself on the back for coming up with a devious scheme that'll make Delboy himself proud. You give the first forgery to Ophiel and he's thrilled, rewarding you and rushing off without a second thought. Then you give the other forgery to Everard and... oh dear. He says he's going to have it examined to make sure it's legitimate, and as you follow him to his broker, it turns out it's the exact same merchant that you just paid to create this forgery. So now you either have to admit the gig is up and forgo the greater reward he offered, or pour yet more money into this merchant's coffers so he'll lie on your behalf to Everard. And the bastard keeps asking you for more and more money to the point where it isn't even worth the reward you end up with. This is what happened to me on my first playthrough, and I found it fascinating. And since I'd need to write a guide about this surprisingly complex quest, I went through reloading my saves to experiment with all the possible ways that I might be able to manipulate all of the various aspects at play to maximise the profits. If you're curious, by the way, it's to create one forgery, give that to Offfuel, and then give Everard the real orb, but that's not important. The fact is that in order to reach that conclusion, I first had to be hoodwinked by the game on my initial run through, and then spend what amounted to an entire workday experimenting and cross-referencing with my colleagues who were playing the game to find every outcome. Because at this point, we knew the game was so open and there were a whole bunch of mad suggestions we tried. Because you never know, Dragon's Dogma 2 is the kind of game where it just might work. Maybe the profit margins would be different if you sold the Jadeite Orb at a merchant in a different region. Maybe there are other people that can get a forgery. Or, wait a minute, isn't there that quest for the Sphinx where it will duplicate any item of your choice? I wonder if... Aha! Now we have two genuine orbs to deal with. And that's the beauty of playing this game completely guideless, because it allows seemingly unrelated quest elements and rewards to play big roles in other areas of the game. This is far from the only example too. Later on in the game you'll meet an artist trying to capture the likeness of a griffin for a sculpture he's making. And to do that you have to make a battle with a griffin last long enough before it flies away so you can study it in detail. It's a tricky quest, unless you happen to have gone and slayed a gorgon in a remote corner of the map first, at which point you can just pull out its severed head and turn the griffin to stone there and then, letting our sculptor friend study it for as long as he likes. The whole thing is covered in these brilliant little tricks that make you feel like a genius for connecting unrelated dots and understanding how this game's wide array of systems can be pulled together for unique solutions to its open-ended challenges. I'm not saying it's the only game to do this. Tears of the Kingdom comes to mind as a game that truly locks this concept into the extreme, but playing Dragon's Dogma 2 in this way, having to interrogate every thread on its massive web while working in tandem with others who were doing the same thing, turned a great game into a magical experience that I don't think I'll ever be able to replicate. For those 3 weeks pre-release, it was a daily occurrence that one of us would pop into our little group chat with, "Hey, did you know you could do this?" And everybody's minds would be blown. It turned a completely single-player RPG into this communal adventure of discovery, which I assume is what people who spend years in forums trawling old Nintendo games for secrets are chasing. That's interesting because when you think about it, it's not really that different from looking up a guide. I'm still seeking out information on how to progress from other people, and yet it's a far more satisfying feeling to get an answer this way than to just type it into Google. The Sphinx's riddles are a perfect example of this. They're obtuse puzzles that challenge your assumptions about how quests in games normally work. I solved most of them on my own, except for one, the riddle of wisdom.
The parent knows the child, yet the reverse is far from true. The child knows not the parent, such is the parent's due. I am a lost child, for kinship do I yearn, so bring to me my parent, that I might better learn.
It's a strange riddle, tasking you with bringing the Sphinx something that it would consider a parent, but it feels like the kind of riddle that has some out-of-the-box solution, and it truly stumped me. We brainstormed all kinds of solutions. Maybe you need to bring it one of the creatures a Sphinx is made up of. Maybe it's an item rather than a creature. Nothing was working until one fateful day, just after 5 PM and we'd all clocked out for the day, I get a notification containing one screenshot. You have got to be fucking kidding me. That moment stands out in my mind 2 years down the line, and I'm sure it still will in 20, which it definitely wouldn't have done if I'd have been able to type the quest name into Google and get the answer. That fleeting sense of, well, that's a weird solution, is instead replaced with a chorus of raucous laughter as we stare in disbelief that something we'd spent all week trying to work out has such a silly answer, and in turn makes the discovery of said answer far more rewarding. Video games are very much about the journey, after all. We don't play games just to get to the end or check them off a list. or at least we shouldn't. We do it to enjoy the experience we have along the way, and finding a game that allows you to share that feeling of discovery with others is what transforms them into something far more memorable than they otherwise would be. So my point is this. Well, for one thing, you should play Dragon's Dogma 2, because it's a far better game than you probably gave it credit for. But more importantly, when you do, and you come across one of its many obtuse objectives, don't ask Google. Ask a friend. Make them part of the experience, and suddenly you'll find the journey to those solutions all the more enjoyable.